Hello there, welcome to Shine Tech's YouTube channel, and in this video I'm going to talk about the endocrine system. So the objective of this video is to look at the definition of hormones and also the classification. Then from there I'm going to talk about the transport of hormones, how these hormones are transported from one point to another. Then lastly I'm going to look at the hormone disposal or hormone degradation. Okay, so let's start by looking at the definition of hormone. So hormones are secretory products of ductless glands released in the bloodstream and transported to specific organs or cells where they elicit physiologic and biochemical responses. So they are products of ductless glands, then they are released in the bloodstream, they are transported to target organs where they perform physiologic, biochemic, or morphologic responses. So that's the definition of hormones. So the same chemical messengers, which we are calling hormones, which perform hormonal functions, are defined as endocrine, neurocrine, paracrine, or autocrine. So we can define them as endocrine, neurocrine, paracrine, or autocrine. So this is not the classification, but we can define them in this way. So what are endocrine? So endocrine hormones, so these are hormones which are produced by classic endocrine cells. Classic endocrine cells, they will secrete these hormones, and then from there they are going to travel in the bloodstream to distant target organs or cells. Then from there they are going to bind to certain receptors on that target cell, and they are going to produce or elicit a physiologic or a biochemical response. So that's really what happens. Okay, so those are endocrine hormones. Neurocrine hormones. Neurocrine hormones, these are produced by neurons or neurohormones or neurosecretory hormones. So they are produced by the neuron, the cell body of the neuron, and then from there they are going to travel to terminal part of the axon. Then in the terminal part of the axon, what happens is that once the neuron is stimulated, it is going to produce those neurons, those hormones into the bloodstream. Then those hormones are going to travel to target organs or cells where they are going to produce certain responses. So an example of these hormones, we can say the hormones which are released by the hypothalamus. Okay, the neurons of the hypothalamus, for example, have oxytocin. So oxytocin is produced by the hypothalamus, and then it is going to be secreted in the terminal part of the axon, and it's going to produce to travel in the portal system of the pituitary gland. Then from there it is going to be released and go to target cells. Okay, and antidiuretic hormones, so those are some of the hormones which are secreted by the neuron part of the hypothalamus, okay, to target cells. Okay, so let's see what happens here. So we have these cells which has been produced there, then we're going to bind to certain receptors on the target cell, okay, and produce a certain physical or morphologic response. So those are neurocrine, they're produced by neurons. Then we also have paracrine hormones. So paracrine hormones, they're produced by cells and travel in the interstitial space or extracellular fluid and go to nearby target cells of different type. Okay, so those are paracrine hormones. They are produced by this a cell, and then they affect nearby cells of different type. Okay, they travel in the extracellular fluid. So those are paracrine hormones. Okay, so we also have autocrine hormones. So autocrine hormone, so these ones are produced by a cell and affect the same type of the cell. So they affect the similar type of cells. Okay, so example, we can talk about the cells in the islet of Langerhans. Okay, so we have cells which affect the same type of cells there. Okay, so from here, let's look at now the classification of hormones. So how can we classify hormone? So hormone can be classified depending upon the chemical nature or mechanism of action. So the chemical nature, we're looking at what is making up the hormone, what is the chemical nature, what the hormone is made up of. So we can classify hormones as such, and then we can also classify them depending upon the mechanism of action, how they perform their actions. Okay, so let's look at the classification depending upon the mechanism of action. So if we classify hormone depending upon the mechanism of action, we are going to have group 1 and group 2 hormones. So group 1 hormones act by binding to intracellular receptors. So these hormones, they are going to diffuse across the cell membrane and bind to certain receptors inside the cell, inside in the cytoplasm or in the nucleus, and perform their physiologic or biochemical responses. Example of these hormones, we have sex hormones, testosterone, and we also have thyroid hormone. Those hormones are lipophilic. They are going to diffuse across the cell membrane and bind to intracellular receptors inside the cell. So they are classified as group 1 hormones. We also have group 2 hormones. So group 2 hormones, they involve second messenger to mediate their functions. So these hormones, most of them, they are lipophobic, so they do not diffuse across the cell membrane, but instead they are going to bind to certain receptors on the plasma membrane, and then from there the same receptors, for example G-coupled receptors, are going to activate a second messenger which is going to mediate their effects. So example of this type of hormones, we have hormones which are made up of proteins, such as talking of insulin, glucagon. Okay, so those ones, they are going to use second messengers. And we also have antidiuretic hormones, also have oxytocin. Those, they are going to use second messengers. So group 2 hormones are further classified as group 2A, group 2B, group 2, and group 2C. Okay, so let's look at the classification of group 2 hormones. So group 2 hormones, as I've already said, they are classified as group 2A, group 2B, group 2C. So group 2A, they use what we call cyclic AMP as second messenger. Okay, so for example, we have antidiuretic hormone and angiotensin 2. So these ones, they are going to use cyclic AMP as their second messenger. Okay, and then we also have other hormones such as glucagon, luteinizing hormone, somatostatin, thyroid stimulating hormone. All those, they are going to use cyclic AMP. So what will happen is that they are going to bind on a G-coupled receptor. So for example, if you have a cell, let's say this is the cell membrane, and then we have a receptor there. So we're going to have a hormone which is going to bind there. So once the hormone binds there, it is going to activate the G-coupled receptor, which is the G-coupled here, which is inside. So the G-coupled receptor has what we call an alpha, beta, and gamma subunit. So the alpha subunit is attached to what we call GDP. So once the hormone binds there on the receptor, this GDP is going to be released, and we are going to see GTP binding to that alpha subunit. So that alpha subunit, once GTP binds, then it is going to activate adenylyl cyclase, which is an enzyme. So adenylyl cyclase once it is activated by the alpha subunit of the GCAPOD receptor, then it is going to convert ATP into cyclic AMP. So cyclic AMP is now going to phosphorylate protein kinase A. So protein kinase A now is going to phosphorylate certain proteins inside the cell, which will lead to cell membrane permeability or even transcription of certain enzymes inside the cell. So those are some of the responses. So that's how a cyclic AMP is produced inside the cell. So group A, they are going to use cyclic AMP as a second messenger. Example, we have antidiuretic hormone, we have angiotensin 2, we have calcitonin, we also have follicular stimulating hormone, we have glucagon luteinizing hormone, also have somatostatin, thyroid stimulating hormones. All those are example of group 2A hormones, which uses what we call cyclic AMP. Okay, so let's move on to group 2B. So group 2B, they are going to use what we call cyclic GMP as a second messenger. So cyclic GMP as a second messenger. Example, we have arterial natriuretic factor and nitric oxide, which is involved in dilation of certain blood vessels. So the steps are similar for cyclic AMP, except that once guanylyl cyclase instead of this is guanylyl instead of adenylyl cyclase. So the enzyme which converts GTP into GMP is guanylyl cyclase here. Then once guanylyl cyclase converts GTP into cyclic GMP, this cyclic GMP is going to activate protein kinase G instead of protein kinase A. So protein kinase G is going to also cause some responses like phosphorylating certain proteins inside the cell. Okay, so the steps are similar to cyclic AMP except for some minor differences. So those are group 2 hormones. They use cyclic GMP as a second messenger. So we also have group C, which uses calcium or phosphatidyl inositol. Okay, so they use calcium or phosphatidyl inositol as their second messenger. We have, for example, we have acetylcholine, we also have gastrin and oxytocin. So these ones, they are going to use calcium or phosphatidyl inositol as their second messenger. Okay, so gastrin is produced in the stomach. It is involved in the secretion of hydrochloric acid. Acetylcholine also is involved in muscle contraction, which will lead to calcium influx inside the muscle tissue, which will lead to contraction. Oxytocin is involved in contraction of the uterus during a childbirth. Okay, so that's classification of hormones in terms of mechanism of action. So we have group A, group 1 and group 2, but group 2 can be further classified as A, B and C. So let's move on to classification depending upon the mechanical nature. So depending upon the mechanical nature, we can classify hormones as amines or amino acid derivatives, or we can classify them as proteins or polypeptides or steroid hormones. Okay, so amine or amino acid derivatives, we have example catechoamines. Okay, catechoamines are one of the examples of amine or amino acid derivatives. Then we also have cyroxine 4 and triiodothyronine T3 is also an example of amino acid derivatives. And then under proteins, we have insulin, glucagon. We also have antidiuretic hormone is also an example of a protein or a polypeptide. Then under steroids, mostly steroids are lipophilic. Okay, so lipophilic, so they can diffuse across the cell membrane of the cell, and most of their receptors are inside the cell. So steroid hormone example, we have sexy steroid, which has testosterone and estrogen. We have vitamin G, we have glucocorticoids. All those are example of steroid hormones, and they are made up from cholesterol. Okay, so this is classification depending upon the mechanical nature. So now let's look at the second part, which is hormone transport. So how are these hormones once formed, how are they transported from one point to another? So hormone can be transported as unbound form or bound form. So in an unbound form, they circulate as free hormones. They don't bind to anything, so they circulate as free hormone. So mostly these are proteins or amino acid derivatives, which are charged, and they are hydrophilic. They are soluble in water. They can travel in the plasma without any problem. But when it comes to bound form, they circulate bound to specific globulins. They bind to certain proteins in the plasma, because most of these cells, most of these hormones are lipophilic. Okay, they are hydrophobic. They cannot travel in plasma because they are hydrophobic, so they bind to certain globulins in the cytoplasm, in the plasma. Then from there, they are transported as such. So that's how hormones are transported. Then when they reach target organs, they are going to separate from, they are going to cleave off from the protein, and then they bind to their receptors on the target cell. Okay, so let's look at hormonal disposal. So under hormonal disposal, once the hormones have been produced, they can be taken up by target cells, or they can be degraded, intracellular degradation. So they can be taken up by the target cell. The same receptors can degrade the same those hormones, or intracellularly degraded, or they can be metabolized. Okay, so we have metabolic degradation or inactivation. So this is mainly done in the liver. Once those hormones have been passes through the liver is going to degrade some of the hormones, and the kidney as well is going to secrete some as urine, and in bowel there will be secretion of certain hormones. So that's how the hormones are disposed of. Okay, so thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to like if at all you like this video, and subscribe so that you don't miss any of my videos, and leave your comment concerning this video in the comment section below.